The chamber smelled like cedar smoke and old parchment, the same as every morning for the past 6 years, and Wren Ashvale had learned to find comfort in that sameness. She arranged her notes by the eastern window where the light came in gold and low. She straightened the inkwell that always sat a half-inch too far from her left hand. Outside, somebody's hound was barking at nothing. Ordinary. Safe. Hers. Then the doors opened, and the king's scent hit the room half a second before he did. Wood smoke and crushed pine needles and something underneath that. Something like ozone before a lightning strike. And every council member rose to their feet so fast that 3 chairs scraped the stone floor at once. Wren rose too. Slower. She always rose slower, and she'd told herself for years it was because she didn't fear him, when really it was because some traitor part of her wanted one more second to watch him cross a room. "Sit," said King Caelan Thorne, and the council sat. He did not look at her. He never looked at her first. That was the rule he'd built without ever stating it, the one everyone in this chamber had quietly memorized. The king's eyes found his master of arms, found his treasurer, found the bristling old wolves who'd served his father, and only landed on the woman at the end of the table once the real business had begun, as if she were furniture he was simply confirming was still in place. Today the business was the southern border, and the southern border was bleeding money. "Triple the garrison at Hollow Ridge," said Councillor Barrand, a barrel-chested man whose left ear had been torn clean off in a border skirmish 30 years ago and never regrown. Wolves healed fast, but not infinitely, and Barrand wore the absence like a badge. Show strength, show teeth. That's the only language the Vargun packs understand. Caelan's jaw, square and shadowed even at mid-morning, gave one slow roll, the way it always did when he was already decided. "Done," he said. "Triple the garrison." Wren set down her pen. "That will start a war," she said. The room went still in the particular way it always did, right before everyone remembered to be offended on the king's behalf. "Forgive me, Advisor Ashvale," Barrand said, not sounding sorry at all. "But the garrison commander outranks you by 100 years and 100 kills. I don't believe—" "I'm not arguing with you," Wren said. "I'm arguing with the math." She slid her ledger down the table, the corner catching a stray beam of light, and didn't wait for permission before she kept going. That was her flaw, if anyone had ever bothered to name it to her face. She mistook being right for being safe. She'd grown up the daughter of a tax clerk in the lowest of the 7 Valley packs, had clawed her way into this chamber on the strength of arithmetic nobody else wanted to do, and somewhere in those 6 years she'd convinced herself that numbers were armor, that if she was correct often enough, loudly enough, no one could touch her. "The Vargun haven't raided in 14 months, she said. "Their grain stores failed last winter. I have the trade reports. I have 3 separate merchant accounts confirming it. They're not testing our border because they're strong. They're testing it because they're starving and they need to know if we'll notice. Triple the garrison. And you don't show strength. You show them we're afraid of hungry wolves, which means we think they're dangerous, which means they start believing it too." Barrand's nostril flared. She could smell the affront rolling off him, hot and sharp as scorched iron. "And what would the clerk's daughter suggest instead?" he said. "Send them a fruit basket?" "Send them grain," Wren said. "At cost. With a treaty attached that costs them more in pride than coin, so it doesn't look like charity. Feed them through one bad winter and you've bought 3 generations of debt instead of 1 war." Silence. The kind that had weight to it, that pressed against the eardrums. Caelan Thorne had not moved. He sat with both forearms braced on the table, the firelight from the hearth behind him catching the old scar that ran from his left collarbone up into his hairline. A scar everyone in the kingdom had a story for, though no one agreed on which one was true. His eyes, when they finally lifted to hers, were the gray of a sky before snow. "Send the grain," he said. Baron's mouth opened, closed. "Your Majesty," he started. "With respect, you have not even—" "I heard the argument," Kaelin said. "It was the better one." He looked back down at the maps as if that settled the matter completely. As if the room weren't full of men who'd watched this same king hold a position for 9 days straight against the combined pressure of every general he had, simply because he'd decided he was right and would not be moved. He had never once done that for any of them. He had done it for her, in some form or fashion, 11 times in the last 4 months. Wren picked her pen back up. Her hand was steady. Her pulse was not. She told herself it meant nothing, that the king was simply a man who respected good math, that this was a king smart enough to know correctness when he heard it, that there was nothing in his sudden softness toward her that deserved the warm, dangerous flutter currently working its way up under her ribs. She told herself that. She did not even slightly believe it. The council did not disperse so much as it leaked away in small, muttering clots, the way water finds every crack in old stone. Wren gathered her ledgers with the deliberate calm of a woman who has felt eyes on her back and refuses to give them the satisfaction of turning around. 11 times, said a voice at her elbow, low and amused. She didn't startle. She'd known Marin Voss long enough to recognize the particular cadence of his needling. Marin, the king's seneschal, a wiry man with ink permanently staining the second knuckle of his right hand because he chewed his pen when he thought no one was watching, and laughed at things that weren't funny yet, the way some men laughed early to test whether a thing was going to become dangerous. "I don't know what you're counting," Wren said. 11 times the king has overruled a general, a treasurer, or his own stated position to side with you. Marin fell into step beside her, his boots quiet on the stone in a way that suggested he'd practiced moving silently for reasons that probably weren't entirely seneschal-related. "I keep a tally. It's become something of a hobby." He sides with sound arguments. "That's not a tally. That's a king doing his job." Baron's argument was sound for 30 years before today, Marin said. Suddenly it isn't, the moment you stand up to contradict it. Funny how that works. Wren stopped walking. The corridor smelled of beeswax and the particular cold stone mustiness that lived in the older wings of the castle, and underneath it, faintly, the dry grass scent that always clung to Marin no matter the season. He kept a stable's worth of horses as a private indulgence, and it never quite washed off him. "Say what you mean to say," she told him. "I mean that Baron is telling anyone who'll listen that you've bewitched the king," Marin said. Bond magic. A working. Something slipped into his wine. A laugh escaped her before she could stop it, short and disbelieving. "I'm a tax clerk's daughter with a talent for arithmetic. I couldn't work a love charm if my life depended on it." "I know that." Marin's eyes, pale brown, watchful, the eyes of a man who'd spent a career learning to read rooms before they knew they needed reading, held hers a beat too long. "I'm not sure the rest of the council does. And I'm not sure," he added more quietly, "that bewitchment is the explanation you should be hoping for. Why wouldn't it be? It's the one explanation that doesn't require me to have done anything wrong." "Because the alternative," Marin said, already turning to go, already letting the corridor swallow the rest of his sentence the way he always did when he'd planted something he wanted to grow on its own, "is that nothing was done to him at all, that he simply can't help it, and a king who can't help something, Advisor Ashvale, is far more dangerous to you than one who's been cursed." He left her standing in the cold stone hallway with her ledgers clutched to her chest and her heart doing something embarrassing and unsteady behind them. And the worst part, the part she would turn over in her mind for the rest of that day and long into the night, was that some traitor sliver of her had heard dangerous and felt, instead of fear, something closer to hope. Caelan Thorne did not return to his study that evening so much as retreat to it, the way a wounded animal returns to its den, not for comfort, but because the alternative is being seen. He stood at the window with his hands braced on the sill, looking out over a courtyard he'd looked out over 10,000 times, and breathed in slow until the low animal hum under his sternum settled back down where he could ignore it. It hadn't settled in 4 months. Not really. He'd just gotten better at pretending. He could still hear Barron's voice in his skull, tight with the particular fury of a man who'd been wrong in public and wronger in front of witnesses. You sided against 30 years of border doctrine for a clerk's daughter's spreadsheet. As if Caelan didn't know exactly what he'd done. As if he hadn't spent the entire walk back to his study cataloging it the same way Barron had. Except where Barron saw bewitchment, Caelan saw something far simpler and far more humiliating. She'd been right, and some part of him, some part he'd thought he'd burned out of himself the night his father died, had wanted, with an intensity that frightened him, to give her that rightness in front of every man who'd ever doubted she belonged in that chamber. That wasn't a king's instinct. That was a mate's instinct. He'd known the word for 4 months and had not let himself think it in full sentences even once. A knock at the door, 2 raps, deliberate, unhurried. He knew the knock before he knew the scent that came with it, dry grass and ink, and didn't bother turning around. "Marin, you're standing at the window again," Marin said, letting himself in without waiting for an invitation, which was a privilege he'd earned across 15 years of being the only man in the castle Caelan trusted not to want anything from him. You only stand at the window when you're trying not to think about something specific. I'm thinking about the southern garrison. You're thinking about Advisor Ashvale's hands, Marin said, while pretending it's the southern garrison. I watched you watch her fold that map back up. You had an expression on your face I haven't seen since your coronation, and it wasn't pride in your kingdom. Caelan's jaw worked once, hard, the muscle ticking visibly along the line of the old scar. Careful. I'm always careful. It's my entire job. Marin crossed to the sideboard, poured 2 measures of the dark spiced wine the king kept for nights he didn't intend to sleep well, and set one within reach without being asked. 11 times in 4 months, Caelan. Your council is starting to whisper about bond magic. Barron's half convinced she's slipped something into your cup. She hasn't. I know that. You know that. But you haven't given me, or them, a better explanation, and the silence is starting to do damage. Marin's voice dropped, lost its needling edge entirely. What is she to you? For a long moment, Caelan said nothing. Outside, the courtyard torches threw long, orange shapes across the stone, and somewhere below a stable hand was singing low and off-key to settle a nervous horse, and the king of the 7 Valley Packs stood with a wine cup he had no intention of drinking, and felt, for the first time in 4 months, the genuine temptation to simply say it out loud to another living person. "She's my mate," he said. The cup in Marin's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. The bond confirmed it the first week she sat at that table. Caelan went on. Low, fast now, like a man finally letting a held breath go. I caught her scent change, fear under the confidence, every time she challenged Barron and waited to see if I'd let her keep her seat. And under the fear, something else. Something that smelled like... He stopped. Started again. Rougher. I haven't told her. I haven't told the council. I haven't told anyone. Until this exact moment, because the day my father died, I swore I would never again let an Alpha King's judgment be ruled by his heart. He loved my mother past all sense, Marin, past strategy, past the kingdom's good. And it cost us the eastern provinces, and it cost him his life, and it taught me, at 11 years old, standing over his body, that softness is a door, and once you open it for one person, you can't control what else walks through. Marin set his cup down very carefully. So you've been yielding to her in council, he said slowly. Not because you're bewitched, because you're terrified that if you don't yield to her there, in front of everyone, in the one room where it's survivable, you'll end up yielding to her somewhere it isn't. Kaylin's silence was its own answer. She doesn't know, Marin said. It wasn't a question. She can't know, Kaylin said. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That's not strategy, Your Majesty, Marin said quietly. That's a man hiding from his own heart and calling it duty. You did it for 9 days straight over a trade dispute once, held a position against your entire war council out of sheer stubbornness, because you decided you were right. You have that in you. The man who doesn't bend. His eyes were steady, not unkind. Don't let her be the one thing you never let yourself fight for. He left without waiting for a response, the dry grass scent of him fading into the corridor, and Kaylin stood alone with the wine going warm in his hand, and the truth sitting in his chest like a stone finally set down after 4 months of carrying it uphill. And underneath the relief, sharp and unwelcome, the old fear his father's death had carved into him at 11 years old, whispering that wanting anything this much had only ever ended one way in his family. He drank the wine after all. It didn't help. The opportunity Marin had practically handed him arrived 3 days later, smelling of blood and bad luck. Wren had ridden out to the eastern grain stores to verify the harvest tallies herself. She trusted her own eyes more than any steward's report, another habit her father had drilled into her with his clerk's ledgers, and his clerk's quiet paranoia about being lied to by men with more power than him. And on the ride back, her mare had startled at something in the hedgerow, thrown a shoe on uneven ground, and put Wren on her back in the mud with a wrenched shoulder and a gash above her eyebrow that bled with theatrical enthusiasm despite being, in the grand scheme of things, nothing at all. She walked the last 2 miles back to the castle leading the limping mare by hand, soaked to the knee, blood drying tacky on her temple, composing in her head the precise, unbothered way she would explain this to anyone who asked so that no one would think to fuss. She had not accounted for the king himself meeting her at the gate. He came down the stairs 2 at a time, which she had never once seen him do. Not even for visiting dignitaries, not even for the war council's worst news. By the time he reached her, his scent had already changed. The wood smoke and pine she'd learned without meaning to was unmistakably his gone sharp and electric, threaded through with something that made the small hairs along her arms lift before she understood what it was. It took her a moment to recognize it as fear. "You're bleeding," he said. 2 words. They came out of him like something torn. "It's nothing. The mare threw a shoe. I went down. You're bleeding," he said again, and reached for her, and stopped himself a hand's width from her face, fingers curling shut in midair as if he'd only just remembered he had no right to touch her. "And you walked 2 miles, bleeding. Why didn't you send a rider ahead?" "Because I was capable of walking," she said, more sharply than she intended. "And I didn't think a wrenched shoulder warranted an escort." It warranted something. His voice had dropped into a register she'd never heard from him, low and rough, scraped raw at the edges. "You could have been—" He didn't finish it. His jaw worked, the muscle along the scar jumping once, and for one unguarded second she watched something move across his face that she had no name for. Not anger, not quite. Something closer to the look of a man who has just imagined, in vivid and unwelcome detail, every way a thing could have gone wrong and arrived too late to stop any of them. I'm fine, she said, gentler now, startled by the size of his reaction and unsure what to do with it. Kalen. His name slipped out without the title before she caught it. Neither of them seemed to notice, or both of them noticed and chose not to say so. It's a scratch. You'll see the healer, he said. It wasn't a request. I don't need. You'll see the healer, he said again, and this time there was something underneath the command that wasn't royal at all, something closer to pleading dressed up as an order. Or I will carry you there myself, and you may decide which version of this evening you'd prefer the castle to witness. She studied him, mud-streaked, blood-tacky, exhausted, and entirely unwilling to back down, and found, against every instinct that had kept her composed and unbothered for 6 years in that council chamber, that she didn't actually want to argue. The healer, she agreed, but I'm walking there myself. Fine, he said, and fell into step beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers twice on the way up the stairs, and didn't apologize either time. The healer's quarters smelled of crushed yarrow and beeswax candles, and old Greta, who had set Kalen's broken arm twice in his boyhood and never once let him forget it, took one look at the cut above Wren's eyebrow, declared it nothing a wolf's healing wouldn't close by morning, cleaned it with brisk efficiency, and then announced she was needed at the kennels for a whelping bitch, and left the two of them alone with a roll of bandage and a look that suggested she'd seen exactly what was happening here and had no intention of staying for the second act. Kalen picked up the bandage before Wren could. I don't need. Sit, he said, not the way he said it to the council. Quieter. An invitation dressed as an order, the way he'd done it on the stairs. She sat. He knelt in front of her chair, a king on his knees, in a healer's cramped quarters that smelled of crushed herbs and candle wax, and his hands, when they came up to her face, were careful in a way that didn't match anything she knew about him. He tilted her chin with 2 fingers, turned her face toward the candlelight, and studied the cut with an attention that made her pulse climb into her throat. This will sting, he said. I'm aware of how cuts work. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, gone before it fully arrived. He pressed the cloth to the wound and she hissed through her teeth despite herself, and his free hand came up, without thought, without permission, the way a body moves before the mind agrees to it, and curved along her jaw, thumb resting just beneath her ear, holding her steady. His scent had changed again. The fear had burned off entirely. What was left was darker, denser, something that pooled low in her stomach and made the room feel smaller than it was. And underneath it, she caught her own scent shifting in answer, sharp, sweet, and unmistakable even to her own untrained nose, and felt her face heat with the mortification of being readable. You're very close, she said. It came out breathless. She hated that it came out breathless. I am, he agreed, and didn't move back. The bandage forgotten between them, his thumb traced one slow line along her jaw, and her breath caught audibly in the quiet, and his eyes dropped to her mouth for one unguarded second, just one, long enough that she felt it like a touch. A pan clattered in the kennel yard outside the window. Distant, probably the whelping bitch knocking something over. It was nothing. It was enough. Kalen straightened so fast his knee cracked against the chair leg, and the careful, gentling mask of the man who'd knelt for her slid back into the king's flat composure in under a second, like a door closing on a room she'd only just glimpsed. Greta will check it in the morning, he said, voice gone formal, distant, wrong. Good night, Advisor Ashvale. He was gone before she could find an answer, his boots fast and uneven on the stone, and Wren sat alone in the candlelight with her fingers pressed to the spot on her jaw where his thumb had been, her heart slamming against her ribs like something trying to get out, and the bandage still only half applied. She finished it herself. Her hands were not steady. She told herself, again, that it meant nothing. She believed herself a little less than she had 3 days ago. The next council session, Kaylin would not look at her at all. Wren noticed it the way she noticed every irregularity in a ledger. A single digit out of place, easy to miss if you weren't already looking for it, impossible to ignore once you were. He addressed Barrand. He addressed the treasurer. When the matter of the grain shipment's terms came to the table, her proposal, 3 days old now, the ink barely dry on the treaty draft, he discussed it with his master of arms as though she weren't sitting 4 feet away with the actual numbers in her lap. "The interest clause is too soft," Barrand said, clearly delighted to find ground to stand on again. "If the Vargoon default, we've no recourse beyond a strongly worded letter." "Add a lien on their southern timber rights," the treasurer offered. "Hard collateral." "Their timber rights aren't theirs to lien," Wren said. "They're held in common trust under Vargoon Pack law. You'd be asking them to violate their own ancestral covenant to satisfy ours. They'd refuse the grain entirely before they'd agree to that. And then we're back to a starving, humiliated, armed neighbor, which was the outcome I was trying to avoid in the first place." Silence. She watched Kaylin's jaw tighten, the tell she'd learned to read across 6 years and a dozen tense mornings, and waited for the small, private capitulation she'd grown unwillingly accustomed to. It didn't come. "The lien stands," he said to the table, not to her. "Add it to the draft." Something cold dropped through her chest. "Your Majesty," she said, and heard her own voice come out tighter than she meant it to. "With respect, that clause guarantees the exact failure we're trying to prevent. The council has made its judgment, Advisor Ashvale." His eyes, when they finally found hers, were the flat gray of a closed door. "Not every argument wins." It was such a small thing. A clause in a draft treaty. A single point of policy among hundreds she'd lost over the years without a second thought. It should not have lodged in her chest like a blade between the ribs. It did anyway. And what stung worse than the policy was the realization, sharp and unwelcome, that some part of her had stopped expecting to lose to him, had built, without noticing she was building it, a small and foolish certainty that whatever else was true, he would not let her be wrong in this room. And he had let her, deliberately, coldly. The morning after he'd knelt in front of her with his thumb against her jaw and his scent gone dark with wanting, he had looked at her across a council table and chosen, with visible effort, to be a stranger. She gathered her ledgers when the session ended with her spine very straight and her face very composed, and did not let herself look at him on the way out, and made it all the way to the corridor before the first humiliating prickle of tears threatened behind her eyes. Not for the treaty clause, for the door that had so plainly, deliberately, shut. Morin caught her at the turn of the stairs, dry grass and ink, his expression unusually careful. "He's an idiot," he said without preamble. "I don't know what you mean." "You do." Morin fell into step with her, matching her clipped pace. "He overruled you in front of the entire council for the first time in 4 months, the morning after he knelt in a healer's quarters and bandaged your head with his own hands. I have eyes, Advisor Ashvale. I have a nose. The whole castle has a nose if it cared to use it, and half of it does." She stopped walking. "What is he so afraid of?" Morin studied her for a long moment, weighing something, and she watched him decide, visibly, the way some men decided things, with a small settling of the shoulders, to tell her at least part of the truth. His father loved his mother past all sense, Morin said quietly. past strategy. It cost the kingdom the eastern provinces, and it cost the old king his life, in a war that softness made worse, instead of better. Kalen was 11 years old when he watched it happen. He has spent every year since convincing himself that an alpha king who loves anything more than his crown is a king who will lose everything, including the people who trusted him to protect them. He hesitated. I think he is currently in the process of discovering that his heart did not get that particular memo, and I think this morning's clause about the timber rights was him trying, badly, to prove to himself that he still can choose the kingdom over you. That's not strategy, Ren said, echoing without knowing it the exact words Marin had used on Kalen 3 nights before. That's cowardice with very good posture. A short, surprised laugh escaped Marin. I won't disagree with that assessment. I'd advise against saying it to his face, but I won't disagree with it. I say everything to his face, Ren said. It's the one advantage of being a clerk's daughter nobody expected to last a season in that chamber. I never learned to be careful with him. She drew a slow breath, steadying. Thank you for telling me. Don't thank me, Marin said, already turning to go, dry grass and ink trailing behind him in the cold corridor air. Thank yourself when you've decided what to do with it. I suspect you're about to make this castle considerably more interesting. Kalen did not sleep that night either. He stood in his study with the timber rights draft on the desk in front of him, the ink not yet fully dry, and felt no triumph in it at all. Only a low, grinding nausea that had nothing to do with the wine he hadn't touched, and everything to do with the look that had crossed her face in the council chamber. He'd watched something close in her, fast and total, like a door slamming on a room he'd only just been let into. And he had done that. On purpose. With his own mouth. He had told himself, walking back from the healer's quarters 2 nights ago with his hand still half-curled with the memory of her jaw against his palm, that he would not let it happen again. That he would build distance the only way he knew how, with policy, with formality, with the cold architecture of a king who answers to no one's heart but the kingdom's, and that the distance would feel, eventually, like relief. It did not feel like relief. It felt like he'd cut something out of himself with a blunt knife and left the wound open to the air. The knock came again, 2 raps, unhurried, and this time he didn't bother pretending he didn't know who it was. I don't want to hear it, Marin. Then it's fortunate I'm not the one who came to say it, said a voice that was not Marin's at all, low and clipped with anger held very carefully on a short leash, and Kalen turned from the window to find Ren Ashvale standing in the doorway of his private study at an hour when no advisor, however senior, had any business being there. She had not bothered to change for the visit. Ink still smudged the side of her hand. Her hair had come half loose from its pins, and under the formal calm she'd clearly walked the entire castle wearing, he could smell the truth of her. Temper, hot and bright as struck flint, and beneath it, fainter, the ache she was working very hard to keep out of her scent and failing. This is not the time, he said. It's exactly the time. You chose it. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her with a control that was its own kind of violence. You overruled me today. Fine. I've lost arguments before. I'll lose them again. I'm not so fragile that one bad clause undoes me. What I want to know is why, because that wasn't the king weighing 2 arguments and finding mine wanting. That was a man punishing me for something I didn't do. I don't owe you an explanation for council decisions. You don't. Her chin lifted. But you knelt in front of me 2 nights ago with your hand on my face like I was something you were afraid to break. And the next morning you looked at me across that table like I was a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. And I think that, Your Majesty, you owe me an explanation for, or at least the courage to say nothing happened, if that's what you intend me to believe. The silence stretched. Outside, wind moved through the courtyard trees with a sound like slow breathing, and the candle on his desk threw their two shadows long and overlapping against the far wall, close enough to touch though their bodies were not. "Something happened," Kaelin said finally. The words came out of him low, almost involuntary, as if they'd been waiting behind his teeth for exactly this kind of cornering. "I have spent 4 months learning to lie to a room full of men I trust about why I cannot stop yielding to you in that chamber, and I am very bad at lying to you specifically, which is, itself, the entire problem." Her breath caught, audible in the quiet study. "Then stop lying," she said. "If I tell you," he said, and his voice had dropped into that rough, scraped register she'd heard once before, in the courtyard, fear-sharp and unguarded, "you will understand exactly why I overruled you this morning, and I am not certain you will forgive me for it, because the reason is not noble. It's fear. It has always only been fear. Tell me anyway." He crossed the room, not fast, deliberate, each step a decision he was visibly making and remaking, until he stood close enough that she had to tip her face up to hold his eyes, close enough that his scent wrapped around her like something with weight to it, wood smoke and pine, and underneath now, something she'd never caught from him before, raw, unhidden want, with no formality left to mask it. "You are my mate," he said. "The bond confirmed it the first week you sat at that table, and I have spent every day since pretending I did not know, because my father loved my mother past all sense, and it cost him his crown and his life, and I swore over his grave that I would never again let an Alpha King's heart rule his judgment." His jaw worked. "This morning I overruled you because I was terrified of exactly this, of standing in a room and discovering I cannot tell the difference anymore between what is right for the kingdom and what is right for you. So I chose wrong, on purpose, to prove to myself I still could." The candle hissed once, low, the only sound in the room. Wren stood very still, her pulse a roar in her own ears, and felt the entire architecture of the last 4 months, every strange yielding, every refusal to meet her eyes first, every unguarded second in a healer's quarters, rearrange itself into a shape she had not let herself see because seeing it had felt too much like wanting it. "You let me win every argument," she said slowly, "because you couldn't stand to disappoint me, and then you disappointed me on purpose, because the alternative terrified you more." "Yes. That is," she said, "the single stupidest piece of strategic reasoning I have heard out of any man in this castle, including Barrand, and Barrand once tried to negotiate trade tariffs using poetry." A sound escaped him that was almost a laugh, rough and surprised, and some of the terrible tension went out of his shoulders all at once, like a held breath finally let go. "I'm aware," he said. "Good," she said. "Because I am not a war you're going to lose by wanting me, Kaelin. I'm not the Eastern Provinces." Her voice softened, lost its edge entirely. "But you don't get to decide that alone, in a study, at midnight, and act it out on me in a council chamber where I have no idea what's happening to me and no say in the decision at all. If you're afraid, say so to my face. Don't punish me for a fear you haven't named." He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked, the way he had in the healer's quarters, the king's composure stripped down to something rawer underneath, and reached up, slow enough that she could have stopped him and didn't, to brush a loose strand of hair back from her face. "I'm afraid," he said quietly. "I am this minute, more afraid than I have been since I was 11 years old." "I know," Wren said. "I can smell it." His thumb traced the same line along her jaw it had traced 2 nights before, and this time there was no kennel yard clatter to interrupt it, no door of formality waiting to slam shut, only the candlelight, and the wind in the courtyard trees, and the long, unbearable inch of space between his mouth and hers that neither of them closed. "Not tonight," he said, low, and it cost him visibly to say it. "Not while half of what's between us is still a secret from everyone but Marin. You deserve better than midnight and a closed door, Wren Ashvale. You deserve the truth of this in daylight, where it can survive being seen." It should have frustrated her. It did, a little. That traitor ache low in her chest, protesting the restraint even as some steadier part of her recognized it for what it was. Not rejection, but the first wholly unselfish thing he'd done since this began. "That," she said, "is the first decision you've made about me that wasn't about your fear." "It's still about my fear," he admitted, almost smiling. "Just a different one. The fear of doing this badly, when it matters this much." She stepped back first, because she understood, with the same clear-eyed precision she brought to every ledger she'd ever balanced, that if she didn't, neither of them would manage to stop it all. And some part of this, whatever it was becoming, deserved better than being rushed in the dark. "Good night, Your Majesty," she said, and let herself smile, just slightly, on her way to the door. "Good night, Advisor Ashvale," he said, and the warmth in it followed her all the way down the cold stone corridor. The breathing room did not last. 3 days later, the Vargan envoy arrived to formalize the grain treaty, Wren's treaty, with the timber clause stripped back out after Kaelin had quietly, without ceremony, overturned his own council ruling in a private session the morning after their midnight conversation, an act that had set Baron's good ear practically smoking with outrage and given Marin, watching from the doorway, the particular look of a man trying not to grin at his king's expense. The envoy was a broad-shouldered Vargan second son named Roth, sent because his father trusted no one else to negotiate, and trusted Roth least of all, which Roth seemed to find more amusing than insulting. He had a laugh like gravel sliding downhill, and he used it often, and he was infuriatingly very good company at the negotiating table, sharp, funny, disarmingly direct in a way that made the formal proceedings move faster than any treaty session Wren had sat through in years. He was also, Wren noticed with mounting discomfort, extremely interested in her. "You drafted this yourself?" Roth asked, on the second day, leaning across the table to study her clause structure with genuine admiration, close enough that she had to resist the urge to lean back. "My father's been trying to get a fair grain price out of your kingdom for a decade. You did it in a season." It wasn't difficult once someone bothered to look at the actual harvest numbers instead of assuming the worst about your pack's intentions. Most advisors who look that closely at us are looking for a weakness to exploit. His grin widened. Easy. Warm. "You looked for a way to help us instead. That's rarer than you'd think, Advisor Ashvale." His gaze tracked frankly down and back up, unhurried, the gravel laugh creasing the corners of his eyes. Rarer, and considerably more attractive. Across the table, Kaelin went very still. Wren felt it before she saw it. The air in the chamber thickening, his scent shifting in a single sharp pulse from the controlled wood smoke he kept for council sessions into something dense and dark and possessive, a low growl edge underneath it that hadn't been there a heartbeat ago. She glanced up to find his eyes fixed on Roth with an intensity that had nothing to do with treaty terms at all, his jaw locked tight enough that the scar along it stood out pale against flushed skin, both hands flat on the table as if he were physically restraining himself from something. "The treaty terms," Kaelin said, voice clipped and dangerously even, "are not the place for personal commentary, Envoy Roth." Roth, to his credit, caught the shift immediately. His nostrils flared once, reading the room the way any wolf would, and his grin turned knowing in a way that made it considerably less charming. My apologies, Your Majesty, he said, not sounding apologetic at all. I forget myself around clever women. Forget yourself elsewhere, Kaelin said. It was not a request. The session ended shortly after, terms agreed, hands shaken, the formal business concluded with brisk efficiency, and Wren found herself, 20 minutes later, cornered gently but unmistakably in the corridor outside the chamber, by a king whose scent had not fully settled back to normal. You were jealous, she said, before he could speak, mostly because she wanted to see what he'd do with the accusation laid bare instead of left to simmer. I was protective of a treaty negotiation, Kaelin said. You were jealous, she said again, of a man who looked at me for 4 seconds longer than was strictly professional. And I would like you to know that I find your jaw doing that thing it does when you're restraining yourself absolutely fascinating, and also slightly ridiculous, given that you have spent 4 months refusing to claim anything at all. His jaw did, in fact, do the thing. I have no claim to make, he said, low. Yet. That doesn't mean I enjoyed watching another man make one in front of me. Then make it, she said, and watched the words land in him like a struck match. Not at midnight, in a study, where no one can hear it. You said I deserved daylight. Here it is, Kaelin. It's daylight. What are you going to do with it? For a moment he only looked at her, the corridor narrow and quiet around them, dust motes turning gold in a shaft of afternoon light, and she watched the war happen behind his eyes. 11 years old at his father's graveside, 4 months of careful denial, 3 days of trying to do this the careful, patient, right way. All of it weighed for one suspended second against the simple fact of her standing in front of him, daring him. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. But he stepped close enough that his forehead nearly touched hers, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, and his hand came up to rest at the curve of her waist, light, deliberate, the first wholly unguarded claim he'd made on her in any space that wasn't private and dark. Soon, he said, rough. I promise you, Wren. Soon. It wasn't enough. It was, somehow, exactly enough. The breathing room, what little there was of it, ended for good 4 days later, when Behrend brought a different kind of weapon to the council table. Not an argument this time, but a piece of paper. This arrived from the Western Archive, he said, laying it down with the careful theatrical weight of a man who knows he's holding something dangerous. A genealogical record concerning Advisor Ashvale's mother's line. Wren's stomach dropped before she understood why. My mother died when I was 7, she said. I don't see what relevance. Your mother, Behrend said, was not, as the records in your personnel file claim, a tax clerk from the Lowland Valley Pack. She was a Hallowmere. He let the name sit in the room, watching it land. Several of the older counselors stirred visibly. The last surviving bloodline of the original treaty wolves, the line that holds, by ancient covenant, a binding vote on any pact between the 7 Valley Packs and any outside territory. A line everyone believed extinguished 60 years ago in the border purges. The room had gone utterly silent. You've spent 6 years, Behrend said, turning to look at her directly for the first time with something other than contempt. Calculation now, sharp and cold. Sitting at this table as a low-ranked advisor, drafting treaties that this council has debated and voted on, as though your voice carried no more legal weight than mine. Half of them, including the grain treaty you just negotiated with the Vargun, required, under the original covenant, a Hallowmere signature to be binding at all. His eyes cut to Kaelin, then back to her. Did you know? No, Wren said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, though her pulse was a hammer against her ribs. I knew my mother's maiden name. I never knew what it meant. She never told me. I don't think she knew how dangerous it would be for me if anyone found out before I'd made a place for myself on my own merits. Convenient, Barron said. Careful, Kaelin said. And the single word came out with enough weight behind it that Barron actually flinched. But the damage was already loose in the room, spreading the way these things did. Not Barron's suspicion of bewitchment anymore. Something worse. Something that made the king's strange yielding suddenly look less like infatuation and more like politics. A king who'd somehow always known, who'd been quietly courting a hidden bloodline's favor for 4 months under the guise of romance, building leverage no one else in the chamber had been allowed to see. Wren watched it happen on their faces, watched 4 months of careful, hard-won trust curdle in real time into something that looked, horribly, like calculation. You knew, said the treasurer, looking at Kaelin now, not at her. You knew what she was, and you've been— I did not know, Kaelin said, and his voice cracked through the room like a whip. Until this exact moment, and I would remind every man at this table that accusing your king of political manipulation in open council is a different conversation than questioning an advisor's pedigree. And I am happy to have either one, but you will choose carefully which. Silence. Barron, to his credit, did not back down completely. Then prove it, he said. Prove this isn't a king who found himself a hidden bloodline and built 4 months of theater around claiming her vote without anyone the wiser. Because from where I sit, Your Majesty, every single thing you've done since this woman joined this table now reads exactly like a man securing power, not a man falling in love. The word landed in the room like a dropped blade. Love, said aloud, in council, for the first time, by the one man who'd meant it as an accusation. Wren felt every eye in the chamber swing toward her, waiting, and felt the floor of the last 4 months tilt sickeningly beneath her, because some small, vicious part of her own mind, fed by years of being the clerk's daughter who'd never quite trusted that her place was earned rather than granted, whispered the same ugly question Barron had just asked out loud. What if it's true? What if none of this was ever about me at all? She looked at Kaelin. He was not looking at the council. He was looking at her, and the expression on his face was not a king's. It was a man's, naked and afraid and furious, all at once, the scar along his jaw stark in the harsh midday light. Wren, he said, quiet enough that it should not have carried, and yet it did, to every corner of that silent chamber. Tell me you don't believe that. And the terrible truth, the gap that had sat open in her own chest since the word Hallowmere hit the table, was that for one unbearable second, she wasn't entirely sure. She did not answer him in the council chamber. She walked out instead, not fleeing exactly, though it felt close enough to fleeing that her face burned the whole length of the corridor, and found herself, 20 minutes later, in the small stone garden behind the eastern wing where she'd gone as a girl, whenever the castle felt too large and too watching, a place with a single old yew tree and a fountain that had stopped running before she was born. Marin found her there. He always seemed to know where to find people. He's not lying, Marin said, without preamble, settling onto the stone bench beside her with the particular care of a man choosing his moment. I was in his study the night he told me about the bond, 4 months ago, long before that genealogical record surfaced. I watched a king admit, with real terror, that he could not stop wanting you, and it had nothing to do with bloodlines because none of us knew about the bloodline, including him. I know that, Wren said. I do know that. But Barron's question is still going to follow me for the rest of my life in that chamber, and I am so tired, Marin, of having to prove that the good things that happened to me weren't stolen or schemed for. That's the clerk's daughter talking, Marin said gently. Not the advisor who balanced 6 years of impossible ledgers and made a starving border pack a better deal than they had any right to expect. You've spent your whole life assuming you have to earn your seat twice as hard as anyone else, because somewhere very early, someone taught you that you didn't deserve to simply be given anything. His eyes were kind. He's not giving you anything, Ren. He's terrified of you precisely because he can't control how much he wants to. She let that sit, the fountain's dry stone basin cold under her palm, the yew tree's bitter green scent thick in the closed air of the little garden. What do I do with the bloodline? She said finally. The vote, the covenant, if it's real. If it's real, Marin said. You have more power in that chamber than every man who's ever condescended to you across that table, including Berend, and you get to decide, finally, on your own terms, whether you ever use it. That's not a weapon someone gave you to manipulate a king into wanting you. That's a birthright nobody bothered to tell you that you already owned. He stood, brushing stone dust from his knees. The only question left, Advisor Ashvale, is whether you're going to let one bitter old man's accusation cost you 4 months of a king finally learning to be brave. He left her there with the dead fountain and the bitter yew, and somewhere in the quiet that followed, Ren found the answer waiting under all the noise. She did not, in fact, believe Kaelin had built 4 months of yielding and longing as theater for a vote he hadn't known existed. She believed, with a certainty that settled into her chest like something coming home, that he had simply, helplessly, fallen, and that the bloodline was a separate truth entirely, hers to claim or set aside, owing nothing to anyone's suspicion of either of them. She found him in the study after dark, exactly where she'd known he'd be. He stood at the window again, that habit she'd come to recognize, the king retreating to the one place in the castle where he let himself look unguarded, and didn't turn when she came in, though she watched his shoulders register her presence by the way they dropped, slightly, like a held tension finally permitted to ease. I don't believe Berend, she said, before he could speak. I want you to know that first, before anything else. I believed it for about 4 seconds in that chamber, because I am occasionally a fool about my own worth, and I am sorry I let it show on my face in front of every counselor in the kingdom. He turned then. His eyes were red-rimmed in a way that told her he hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, had stood at that window doing nothing but replaying the worst 4 seconds of the last 4 months. I would have told them everything, he said, low. The bond, the 4 months, all of it, the moment you walked out that door, except that I realized halfway through standing there that the only person whose belief I actually needed was already gone, and I did not know how to chase you down a corridor in front of my entire council without making everything they already suspected look true. You could have just chased me, Ren said. Crown be damned. I'm learning, he said, with something that was almost a wry, helpless laugh. 4 months ago, I would not have known how. She crossed the room toward him, slow, the way he'd crossed toward her once in this same study, each step a decision remade. The bloodline is real, she said. I confirmed it this afternoon with the Western Archive scribe myself, while you were presumably standing at this window being miserable. My mother was a Hallowmere. I have a binding vote on every treaty this kingdom has signed for 6 years, and apparently several it signed before I was even born, and none of it, Kaelin, changes one single thing about what I want from you, which is the same thing I wanted 3 weeks ago when I had no idea any of it existed. You. His breath left him in a long, unsteady exhale, and the careful distance between them collapsed in a single step. His hands came up to frame her face the way they had in the healer's quarters. No candlelight excuse this time. No kennel yard clatter waiting to interrupt. Only the low fire in the hearth and the dark window at his back, and 4 months of fear finally burning all the way down. "I should have told the council the truth the moment I knew it," he said. "I should have stopped hiding behind clauses and overruled votes and midnight conversations no one else was allowed to witness. You deserved better than a king too afraid of his own father's ghost to claim you in daylight." "You're about to," Wren said, and it wasn't a question. "I am," he said. "Tomorrow, in front every man at that table who's ever doubted you, and I will not soften a single word of it for their comfort." His thumb traced the line of her jaw, the same path it always seemed to find. "But tonight I'd like to do something I should have done in this exact room 3 weeks ago, if you'll let me." "Kaelin Thorne," she said, breath gone unsteady. "Asking permission. I should have that carved into the castle gate." "Wren," he said low, "may I kiss you?" "You may," she said, have been considerably faster about it, and closed the last of the distance herself. His mouth met hers slow at first, careful, the kind of careful that came from a man who'd spent 4 months convincing himself he wasn't allowed this. And then her hands found the front of his shirt and fisted there, and something in him broke loose entirely, the kiss deepening, one hand sliding to the small of her back to pull her flush against him, while the other still cradled her jaw like she was something he'd been afraid, for months, that he'd never be permitted to hold. She felt it through the bond before she felt it in words. A warmth flooding through her chest that wasn't only her own. His relief and his want, and underneath both, startlingly, something like coming home. The same thing she'd felt standing in the dead fountain garden an hour before, except now it was shared, doubled, echoing back and forth between them until she couldn't tell anymore where her own feeling ended and his began. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing unsteadily, his forehead came to rest against hers. "That," he said, voice wrecked, "was worth every day of being afraid of it." "Don't be afraid of it again," she said. "I'm not going anywhere, Kaelin, bloodline or none." "I know," he said. "I think that's what finally frightens me least." The council convened the next morning under a tension so thick it had its own weather. Baron sat with his ruined ear angled toward the head of the table, posture rigid, clearly braced for a fight he expected to win on the simple strength of being the one to ask the question no one else dared. Kaelin did not sit. He stood at the head of the table, one hand braced on its surface, and looked at every man in that chamber in turn before he spoke, the old scar along his jaw catching the cold morning light. "3 weeks ago," he said, "Councillor Barrand asked, in this room, whether the things I have done for Advisor Ashvale across these past 4 months were theater built around a hidden bloodline's vote." His voice did not waver. "I am going to answer that question fully, once, and then I do not intend to discuss it again, because the woman in question deserves better than being a standing item on this council's agenda." He let that settle. Baron's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Wren Ashvale is my fated mate," Kaelin said. "The bond confirmed it the first week she sat at this table, before any of us knew her bloodline existed, before she knew it herself. I have spent 4 months yielding to her in this chamber not because I was bewitched, and not because I was courting a covenant vote I had no knowledge of, but because I was a coward. Because my father loved past all sense, and it cost him everything, and I built my entire reign on the belief that I could never afford to risk the same. I was wrong. I have been wrong for 4 months, and I compounded that wrong 3 weeks ago by overruling her on a treaty clause out of nothing but fear, which cost this kingdom a better outcome and cost her a humiliation she did not deserve, and that I will be working to earn forgiveness for some time." He turned finally to look at Wren directly, in front of every man at that table. She is also, as it happens, the last living Hallowmere, and holds a binding vote on every treaty this council has signed in 6 years, a fact she learned at the same moment the rest of us did, and a fact that changes nothing about why I have fallen for her, because I fell before I had any reason to suspect she carried power I needed. His eyes did not leave hers. I am not asking this council's permission. I am telling you what is true, because a king who hides what's true from the people meant to serve beside him is no better than the fear that made him hide it. Advisor Ashvale will sit at the head of this table's covenant matters from this day forward, by right of blood, and she will sit beside me, by right of bond, and any man at this table who has a problem with either is welcome to bring it to me directly, where I will not be nearly so patient as I have been with whispers behind closed doors. The silence that followed had a different texture than the one 3 weeks before. Not the silence of shock at a king's strange softness, but the silence of men recalculating in real time exactly how much ground had just shifted beneath them. Berend was the one who finally broke it, and what he said surprised every person in that room, Wren included. "The grain treaty's better terms," he said slowly, "have already started paying off. The Vargun sent a second envoy this week, not for negotiation, for thanks." He looked at Wren with an expression she had genuinely never seen on his face before. Something grudging, but real. "I have spent 30 years building this kingdom's defenses on the assumption that strength only ever looks like teeth. It seems I have something to learn from a clerk's daughter after all." He inclined his head, stiff, formal, but not insincere. "Advisor Ashvale." "Counselor Berend," she said, and let herself, for the first time in 6 years, simply accept being seen without immediately needing to prove she'd earned it. They did not announce the bond to the wider kingdom that day, or even that week. Kaelin had learned at least that much caution, that some truths needed daylight to survive being seen, and others needed a slower kind of light, the kind that came from two people simply living a thing out loud, in small, ordinary moments, until the world around them caught up. What he did do, 3 nights later, was something far smaller and far more dangerous to his pride than any council declaration. He found her in the archive room, alone, surrounded by the unrolled genealogical records of a bloodline she was only beginning to learn the shape of, candlelight throwing her shadow long across 200 years of names she hadn't known were hers a month ago. She looked up when he entered, and her scent, that sharp, bright, unhidden thing he'd learned to read before he ever learned to admit what it meant, softened immediately into something warm and unguarded that still, every time, undid him a little. "I lost an argument today," he said, sitting on the edge of the table beside her without ceremony, a king with ink-stained fingers and no crown in sight. "Marin wants to restructure the Eastern garrison rotations, and I think he's wrong, and I let him have it anyway, because he's been right about nearly everything else for 15 years, and I owe him the benefit of the doubt." "That's not the same as losing an argument to me," Wren said, eyebrow lifting. "No," Kaelin agreed. "Losing to you isn't really about the argument at all." He reached over, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so easy now it barely registered as brave, though 3 weeks ago it had cost him everything he had. "I think I finally understand what my counsel couldn't. It was never that I couldn't win against you. It's that I never wanted to. Winning against you would have meant being right at the cost of you being wrong, and somewhere in the last 4 months I stopped being able to want anything that cost you something." Wren set down the scroll in her hands. "That," she said quietly, "is the actual answer to the question Berend's been asking since the start. Not magic, not a covenant vote. Just a man who'd rather lose every argument in the kingdom than watch the one woman he loves swallow being wrong. Yes, Kaelin said. I'd like that carved somewhere less public than the castle gate, if you don't mind. My pride would like to keep some small portion of itself intact. She laughed, real, low, unguarded, and leaned into him, and felt the bond hum warm and steady between them, the way it had every night since the study. Two halves of the same low current finally let to run, uninterrupted. Stay, she said simply. Tonight. No council, no covenant, no crown, just this. He didn't answer with words. He drew her in instead, slow, his mouth finding hers in the candlelight among 200 years of names that were now, somehow, both of theirs to carry forward. And the kiss this time held nothing held back, nothing waiting for permission, only the quiet, breathless certainty of two people who had each, finally, in their own time and their own fear, chosen the other freely, with no one left to convince and nothing left to prove. The candle burned low. Neither of them moved to relight it. Outside the archive window, the castle settled into its ordinary nighttime quiet. A hound barking once, far off, at nothing. And inside, in the dark, the Alpha King who could deny her nothing, finally stopped pretending he ever wanted to.